Good evening. Good evening. There we go. There we go. Welcome. My name is Anya Kreitney, and I'm a program specialist here at the Library of Congress. I work within the library's literary initiatives team. In our office, we are always thinking about new books, great authors, and informative conversations. Our goal is to find ways to demonstrate the contemporary literary landscape, and we love to dig down deep to investigate ideas that are important to our world at large. That's why I'm excited to introduce one such program right now, our conversation with award-winning author and historian, Kerri Greenidge, and the 14th Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden. Tonight, Dr. Hayden will lead Kerri in a conversation about her beautiful book, The Grimkes, The Legacy of Slavery in an American Family. This book, as you may suspect from the title, charts the contributions of Sarah and Angelina Grimke, the famous abolitionist sisters who were active in the middle part of the 19th century. But the book does something else. It forges a long overdue corrective. It introduces us to the Black side of the Grimke family. Figures like Nancy Weston, Archibald and Frances Grimke, the inventive and very impressive Foron family, even tracking 3 generations down to Angelina Grimke. Throughout the book, Kerri proves that the Black Grimkes, especially the women in the family, were themselves instrumental to abolitionism, to education, to activism that led all the way to Harlem Renaissance. Now, we know that families are complicated, that legacy is thorny, that inherited racism is damaging and sometimes lasting, that intergenerational and interracial cooperation is essential, albeit difficult. Kerri Greenidge has managed to write a book that contextualizes these dilemmas in such a way that inspires us, and inspired me, to reevaluate the stories we tell about our families and our communities. I hope you can tell I loved Kerri's book. Before I turn it over, I just want to do a little light housekeeping. If everyone could remember to turn off their phones, and please be thinking of questions while this conversation is happening. At the close of their conversation, I'll come back on stage and invite questions from the audience. Just be aware that when you raise your hand and ask a question, a mic runner will come to you, and that basically gives the library permission to include your question in our video. Book sales and signing will follow the event in the back. And of course, please come back to Live at the Library. We love to see you here. So without further ado, please welcome Kerri Greenidge and the Librarian of Congress.
Well, we're going to start with full disclosure. As a history nerd, and especially African American history, I said, I'd like to do this one.
Yes.
This is when they looked at the authors coming. I said, oh, please, can I do this one? And maybe it's because I'm librarian, I don't know.
Yes.
But it is an honor for me to be with you.
Well, thank you so much. My family is a huge fan. I'm a huge fan, so thank you so much for having me. This is wonderful. I could not have written the book without access to records like the Library of Congress, so thank you so much.
And being a true librarian, I have to do that.
Yes.
Now, how did you get interested in the Grimkes and this story? How did that come about? Because this is a lot of work.
Yeah.
A lot of time.
So we were talking about this backstage. I can very much remember being about 7 years old and going to a very progressive school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we had to study the abolitionists, and we each had to choose people. And I studied Sarah and Angelina Grimke, and my teacher introduced me to Gerda Lerner's book, The Grimkey Sisters from South Carolina, and I remember running home and showing my grandfather, Samuel Lee Dance, who was from Petersburg, Virginia, and didn't have more than a high school education. Hi, there's my cousins there who are related to Samuel Lee Dance. So Samuel Lee Dance, I went home and I told him all about, I had read this book about the Grimkes, and him saying, well, that's fine, but don't believe everything that you read about the Grimkes, question things and stories that are told, and know that they had Black relatives, one of whom lived in Boston, and make sure you question things. And so I remember putting that kind of in the back of my head, and he was always telling us things of that nature when we were children. And then when I was researching my first book on William Monroe Trotter, I was reading a lot of old issues of the Black press. And it didn't matter which newspaper I was reading or magazine from roughly 1880 to 1930, the Grimkes were always in there. So they would be either in the society page or in an account of some piece of legislation that was being passed. And so I really started to wonder, and I would put all of that to the side, but I really started to wonder how, number one, this family that is so ubiquitous in the Black press, why was there rarely a mention of the fact that they're related to the white Grimkes, who were so famous before the Civil War. The other thing that I was very interested in is that as historians, traditionally when we talked about the Grimkes, we tended to bifurcate them. So the white Grimkes were over here, the Black Grimkes were over here, and if they're talked about together, it's like in a footnote or the like last chapter that's like, oh, and by the way, they had these Black nephews, and wasn't it great that they helped them uplift themselves after the Civil War? And so I was really concerned with that story, because the more historical evidence I read, the more I was encountered with the fact that that didn't seem to be the case, right? And so I really wanted to explore that story, and more than kind of go in and say, aha, this is wrong, I really wanted to go in and question, why do families and societies tell these stories, right? Even if there's all this evidence to the contrary, that something else was going on.
And just back to your grandfather.
Yes.
You said he liked to question and told you, don't believe the hype. Or
Yeah.
don't believe don't believe it.
Yeah, well, he and my grandmother, Samuel Lee Dance, Petersburg, Virginia. My grandmother was from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Both of them were, working people, worked very hard, but they read everything. And my grandfather, Samuel Lee Dance, was always telling my sisters and I and my cousins, when you're reading something, read it and absorb it, but also remember that you're just reading like a piece of it. It doesn't matter who it's by. Even if you really like the person that you're reading, right? You're reading something that might not be when it appears on the page. And so he told us that with everything. My younger sister's a novelist, my older sister's a playwright, and I think we all kind of approach our work from that perspective.
And so as you started looking at evidence or doing the research, because it is so thoroughly researched, you were looking at things that other people had looked at. Mm-hmm. So what happened?
I think it's a matter of taking Black people seriously in the archive. And so when Black people give an account of a situation under slavery or its aftermath, taking that as seriously as the white people who are recounting it, and looking at that from multiple sources. So the Black press, the Black press, the Black press. So you were talking back there, you were mentioning Jet magazine, and nothing would happen. You didn't realize anything was happening if it wasn't in Jet magazine for like a while. Like
for certain age people.
And definitely the Black press, local, well-known newspapers, not well-known newspapers, they have the information on a lot of these families after the Civil War, when those families were like coming into prominence. And so I don't think I was uncovering anything. I think I was more analyzing sources from a very different perspective and questioning the reams of letters between the Grimke sisters and their white family members that talked about their slaveholding, right? That gave a very different picture. Just those letters back and forth for over 30 years of what was actually happening in the household. And that the violence of their brother Henry, which was not a secret. So that was not, I didn't have to dig very far to find that evidence. And so really just paying attention to the sources, and then going back and forth over additional sources that were from the words as much as possible of enslaved people.
And trusting that.
Yes.
So there is wide cast of characters, a lot of decades. So if you could just give us a little back there. So there's the White Grimkes.
Yes.
And then, so there are the two sisters that
Yes.
most people knew, Sarah.
Yes, so Sarah and Angelina Grimke were born in Charleston, South Carolina. They were the daughters of one of the wealthiest slaveholding families in the Carolinas at the late 18th century. And their story had been portrayed or has been portrayed as the Grimke sisters. Sarah, her father dies in roughly 1819. Sarah Grimke realizes slavery is wrong. She moves to Philadelphia. She converted to Quakerism. This is what the story was. It turns out that isn't exactly true. Goes to Philadelphia and then becomes a leader in anti-slavery politics. And then her younger sister, Angelina, eventually arrived in Philadelphia, and the two of them are famous for two things. The first thing they're famous for is becoming the first, or Angelina becomes the first white woman or woman of any race to speak before a legislative body when she addresses the Massachusetts legislature. And then she and Sarah go on to write these canonical texts of the anti-slavery movement. And they are credited with linking together women's rights and the anti-slavery movement. So they're talking about these two things, and their fame ends up bringing attention to both of those two things. Angelina ends up marrying Theodore Dwight Weld, a radical abolitionist who's famous for being part of the Lane Rebels, who were a group of abolitionists in Cincinnati who eventually are expelled or challenged because they started to question and wanted to speak out on anti-slavery. And so the White Grimkes and Grimke Wells have this very storied, very special, I would argue, role in the white abolitionist movement. The story that's often told about that, or sort of the way that that is wrapped up in a lot of historical takes, is that the Grimke sisters find out at the height of Reconstruction that their brother Henry Grimke had sons by an enslaved woman. And the story is that they read this in a newspaper and they discover the sons, and they eventually support the sons as they enter their new phase in freedom.
Now, you see my reaction, because I pencil in as
Yes.
I read, and I asked you about that. I said, page 172.
Yes.
They open a newspaper, and there's some young men at Lincoln University, and their name is Grimke.
Yes.
I wonder if they're related.
Yes.
Is that supposedly how it happened?
Well, that's a way, of course, that many previous historians, historical takes, have assumed that that story is the way that it happened, right? They're assuming, based on what the Grimke sisters themselves say, that that's what happens. When you're reading the sources and the way that the Grimke family talks about enslavement, and the fact that the Grimke sisters remained in close contact with their family in Charleston. So it's not as if they left and went to Philadelphia and suddenly they no longer talk to their family, right? They have a very deep relationship with their sister and the rest of their family, who remain slaveholders and remain Confederates up until the end of the Civil War. And so my question was, why would they have been surprised, given that they're having conversations in letters about the violence of their brother, and what do they do with him, the fact that he's so violent and it's embarrassing for the family, and the fact that they have one enslaved man named Stephen, who I talk about, who the family doesn't know what to do with because he suffers from fits. And it turns out they talk openly about the fact that he has those fits because from the time he's a little boy, he was enslaved to Henry, and Henry liked to torture him, basically bang his head against things and watch him, suffer. And they're talking about this over years, right? And so the question would be, okay, they're Sarah and Angelina Grimke. They are not dumb women. They are very, very conscious about slavery and its dynamics and violence. They write about it eloquently. What would it mean if they picked up a newspaper and suddenly saw this name? It would defy belief to me, just given it, that this was a surprise. Although for them, their story definitely it was a surprise, right?
To see them in the paper.
To see them in the paper, yes. And so really I want to lean into, again, not to say, aha, this is wrong, right? But really to say, well, what does it mean that that could be the story that the white Grimkes tell themselves, right? And they really believe it. And that then our memory of the Grimkes, we kind of just accept that as the story, right? When it doesn't seem like that, it defies the basic evidence that we have.
And okay, so the early years, and let's introduce now the Black Grimkes.
Yes.
Archie, Frank, and John.
Yes.
Who were the
yes. They were the
children of Sarah and Angelina's brother.
Brother, yes.
Henry, who beat people.
Yes.
Okay. So they didn't know that Henry had those children.
Yes, well, that's the story. Yes, yes, that's the story that they told, and that frankly, you know.
And there are photos in here.
Yes.
Oh, just okay.
All
right.
Yes. Yeah.
Depends on how you look at sources.
Yeah. Yeah, and I will say that. The violence of the Grimke home in Charleston was not something that was hard to find. It was a matter of looking at newspaper accounts and their own talks about themselves, right? And how they approach being slaveholders, right? And one of the things that was very telling to me was that there's kind of this debate. People were like, oh, well, did Henry mean to free he was in love with Nancy Weston and he would have freed the sons, but there was a law in South Carolina that prevented people from freeing their slaves, therefore he couldn't free them. And the problem with that is that Charleston was notorious as a city in which white slaveholding men had sexual relationships with enslaved women, so much so that some of the churches, interracial families would sit in special pews. So this was not like this was like something that was considered behind closed doors in the way that we kind of think that it would be. And so one of the things I looked at was, well, okay, so what is Henry's relationship with Nancy Weston? And what would have been his relationship with his sons? And the most sort of haunting thing to me as a historian was finding the rewrite of his will. So we know Archie is born in 1849. Henry Grimke rewrote his will in November 1849, so Archie would have been a few months old. And his son, by this enslaved woman, is a few months old, and he rewrote the will to say that this enslaved woman and any progeny she had would be the property of his white children. So that means he has the baby. So again, to be very clear, the baby Archie is a few months old. Nancy Weston is in a house that he has built for her that's a few feet away from his house, right? And he goes and purposely rewrites his will to say that she and any children he has by her will be enslaved to his other children, right? So that's a fact, right? To me, it would seem that there's something else going on here besides, oh, I can't feed my family because, right? And particularly, I put him in juxtaposition to, say, the Purvis family, which was also a family where the white enslaver had sexual relationships with an enslaved black woman, and he moved his family out of Charleston, right? He got all his money together and he moved them out, right? And so what does it mean that Henry Grimke doesn't move them out? He literally goes in and rewrites his will so that their enslavement will be in perpetuity.
And you did say sexual relations, and all of those encounters were not love.
Yes, I mean, we historians, black women historians before me, much better black women historians than I am, have done phenomenal work on what, these relationships looked like. And it's not to say that there weren't moments when enslaved black women negotiated in whatever way they could their situation underneath slavery. But it is also to admit that that can happen and two things can exist at the same time. It can also be that you are Nancy Weston who's enslaved to somebody who everybody knows is notoriously violent, right? There's evidence that Nancy Weston was sold before by another family, and that she had another child, and that child is gone, either died or whatever happened. She then is purchased by the Grimkes. What choices does she have as a woman? What are her options when he says, I'm going to move you into this house way out in the country, away from Charleston, right? And you're going to have this house, and all the other enslaved people are around you, right? What was that relationship, right? Even if Nancy Weston was a smart and very inventive and intelligent woman who insisted that she raise her sons to think of themselves as free, right?
And that's what she did.
Yes.
And that was Archie and Frank and John.
Yes. Yeah.
So now, did they start out like Little Lord Fauntleroys and all that, and because they had some privilege or something, or what was their early life?
So their early life, so Nancy Weston, there's evidence that she was related to the Weston family, which was a free black family in Charleston. Charleston had one of the largest concentrations of free black people in the antebellum South. And so it was possible to be a black person in Charleston and be enslaved, but have like siblings who were free, right? And so Nancy Weston is a member of this Weston family who were, artisans, black artisans in the city of Charleston. And so she, according to Archie, because she could not read or write, that was another clue I had about her relationship with the Grimkes. Why, if they were so into reading and writing and benevolent, why did they never teach her how to read? Or write, right? So, but nevertheless, she raises her sons to know that they are in proximity to the free Westons. So much so that before Henry died, she sort of lived in her own house. She was allowed to raise her own, a little bit of livestock. She was allowed to grow her own food. And so from that, she ends up sort of raising her sons to believe that, as she would say, the best blood of the South runs through your veins, is what she would say to them, according to Archie. Henry Grimke dies in 1852. The kids are 3, 2, and she's pregnant with John, who was born after Henry dies. And immediately the Grimke family brings her to Charleston, and they refuse to provide for her. Another clue about the relationship. They basically say, we're going to put you in Charleston. We still technically own you, or the half-brothers of your sons technically own you legally, but we're not going to provide for you. So if you have 2 toddlers and an infant on the way, no food, no clothing, where are you going to go? She ends up going into a house on Cumming Street in Charleston, and when I did a book talk there, I got to go back by right where the site of where it would have been, even though it's not still standing, as far as I know. And so she moved into this house that her relatives, the free Westons, built for her, because they were basically saying, you aren't free, you have toddlers, you can't run, where are you going to go? They build her a house. And so for the next approximately 10 years, until the Civil War, she lived in that house, and the way she survived was that she joined her free Weston cousins in doing work that we know black women did in Charleston for the city of Charleston. So black women in Charleston had a whole underground economy and above ground economy that let the city function. So she does laundry, and the boys, when they're as young as 4 and 5, are responsible for taking pounds of laundry on their head and transporting it throughout, and the free Westons and Nancy Weston did the laundry for everybody in the neighborhood, and through that she gets a little bit of money, some from free black people, some from white people who wanted their laundry done by her, and she does it, and she uses that money to pay for them to go to school. There was one school in a church that was run by a white minister, and if you could pay the fee, black children who were free were allowed to go there. Now she's a Weston, so she lets them go to school there, and that's how they learn how to read.
And how did they get to Lincoln?
Yes.
So that they were in the paper to be discovered.
Yes, you're getting back to the so-called discovery.
That one really got me.
Yes. So we know that the brutality, the Civil War begins, and Montague, Henry's white son, returns to Charleston. And Montague basically goes into the house on Cumming Street and tells the boys, I am your owner, and you are to do what I say.
That's Archie, the half-brother.
The half-brother. Archie ran away. Frank ran away as well. Archie managed to disguise himself as a girl and hide in like chimneys and underneath tables, right? And his family protected him. Frank is slightly younger and runs away, but Montague gets Frank and basically beats him within an inch of his life, and this is talked about amongst the memory of the black people in Charleston. So black people in the 1890s still talk about Montague beating him through the streets of Charleston. He's horribly injured. He's put into the Charleston jailhouse, which is a notorious and very violent form of discipline for enslaved people. Montague then takes him out and sells him to a Confederate soldier. And when the Union troops arrived in Charleston, and so they claimed the city, both Frank and Archie run to the Union side. And they basically give themselves up and say, we're on your side. And so they follow the Union Army. And then when surrender comes and 1865 comes and the war is ending, they return and are reunited with John and their mother. And their mother is destitute. She got a job working and cleaning what becomes the Cardozo School, which was a school for free black people, after the Civil War. And she goes to the founders of that school, who are abolitionists, called the Pillsburys, and she basically says, I want my sons to get out of Charleston. I'll do anything to get them out of Charleston. And the Pillsburys say, they're part of the New England Freedmen's Aid Society, they say, okay, then this was, happened often, we'll bring them from Charleston to Boston. The boys go to Massachusetts. They both go one way. One goes to Rhode Island, the other goes to Stoneham, Massachusetts. They're there for about 6 months, and then word gets out that they actually aren't going to school. The white people who took them in are forcing them to work. And Nancy finds out about it. Still not exactly sure how she finds out, but she does find out about it, and she goes to the Pillsburys and says, this isn't what I want them to do. I gave them to you so they would go to school. And so eventually, the Pillsburys arranged for them to go to Lincoln University in rural Pennsylvania, which admits them, and that's sort of how they get on track. And as a result of their precocity as students, they are profiled in various abolitionist newspapers and pronounces their name Grimkey. And the Grimkey sisters read these newspapers, and they say, oh my goodness, we've discovered that these are our nephews.
And it didn't hurt that they were talented and they were featured.
That they were talented and that they were featured and that they, they were considered the brightest students that had gone through Lincoln up until that time. They should go on to, other schools after Lincoln. One of them should at least become a lawyer. So they were very, 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 very bright, according to the people at Lincoln.
Oh my. And then it keeps going. All right, so they make the discovery, Sarah and Angelina. Mm-hmm. They're delighted, right?
Yes, although I kind of complicate sort of how they treat the young men when they are in contact with them, when they come to Hyde Park, Massachusetts, which now is a neighborhood in Boston, but at that time was sort of a little country town outside of Boston. It's where the Wells live. And they invite the sons in. They agree to pay for their tuition to Lincoln. But within the first year, Frank and Archie, or Frank more so than Archie, has sort of a conflict with the sisters in terms of how they treat the young men in letters and so forth. One of the things that happens is that Frank gets horribly ill. So much so that he's basically flunking out of school, and Archie and Frank share a room, and so Archie is having to sort of, as he says, pound on his chest every night to make sure he's staying awake, and he asks the sisters if they can come back to Hyde Park so that Frank can get medical attention. And the sisters basically accuse them of being lazy, saying that they have the worst blood of the South running through their veins, that their basically enslaved side is coming through, that they're not going to pay for it anymore if they don't remain at Lincoln. And so for Archie kind of just mentions this in passing. Frank, as a result of this, when he graduates from Lincoln, he doesn't accept their offer to pay for him to go onto his next schooling. He basically says, I'm going to pay for it myself. And his famous quote in his letter is that they believe that they know colored people, but they do not know colored people. And so he goes off and he goes to Princeton and he pays his own way and he finds help. Archie moves in with the Wells, and eventually they pay for him to go to Harvard Law School.
And then their wives.
Yes.
Archie and Frank.
Yes. So Frank marries a woman who, out of this book, I hope a lot of things will happen. One of them is that somebody will do like a proper single biography of Lottie Fortin. So Charlotte Fortin is member of a family called the Fortin family, who were a famous free black family in Philadelphia from roughly the 1770s all the way up to and through the 1830s, 1840s. Her grandfather was James Fortin, who was the leading sailmaker in Philadelphia for a time. And her aunts and uncles were the children of this sort of founding family in Philadelphia. So the Fortins helped found the African Methodist Episcopal Church with Richard Allen. They helped create the Freedmen's Aid Society. They helped create one of the first vigilance committees that helps rescue fugitive slaves who are being attacked by slave catchers in the city of Philadelphia. And so that's her family that she comes from. Her mother dies when she's 3 years old. Her father remarried. And following that, Lottie is raised by her aunts, Harriet Fortin Purvis and Sarah Fortin Purvis, founders of black schools in Philadelphia, founders of, and who joined with the Grimkey sisters, ironically, in the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. And so Charlotte really grows up as an activist and as an intellectual. When she's a teenager, she moved to Massachusetts and attended the Salem State Normal School, which is now Salem State University. She's the first black woman to receive a teaching degree from a predominantly white institution in the 1850s. And through that, she writes poetry, she teaches at mostly mixed race schools in Salem. She writes poetry, she corresponds with abolitionists. And during the Civil War, she eventually gets a job working with the freed people on the Sea Islands of South Carolina. And through that, she writes for the Atlantic Monthly. She becomes the first black woman to publish a piece in the Atlantic Monthly magazine. Her work called Life on the Sea Islands becomes sort of this treasured text that describes freed people and what it was like going down there in 1863 and educating and helping to educate that population. And then after the Civil War, she's, an activist, a writer, and she finds that she still can't find a job. And one of the things I wanted to specify and stress in the book is that, the evidence is that she becomes very disillusioned with her relationship with white abolitionists. Because by this point, she's published in Atlantic Monthly, she's translated a French novel into English, she's written for Scribner's, she has multiple poems published in all these newspapers, and none of her white abolitionist friends, and she underlines this and puts a question mark, so she's... Oh. Will hire her for anything, right? And so she goes to South Carolina, and then she eventually gets a job in the Treasury Department here in DC, where she meets and gets reacquainted with Frank Grimke. And they eventually get married. He's 28, she is 41.
I like that part.
Yes, exactly, yes. And at that time, Frank graduates from Princeton Theological Seminary. He takes the helm of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church here in DC, and transforms that church into a leading site of civil rights activism. After the Civil War, Lottie is his wife, and they live here in Washington, D.C., and she, my sort of reading of their relationship is one of adoration, but also one in which Frank had various ideas about the role of black women, and one of those ideas was that it was not becoming for him to be a minister and have his wife be of equal intellectual standing in the community. So Lottie was an activist. She continued to work with Angelina Grimke, and she was a member of the National Association of Colored Women, and yet her real sort of fire was as an intellectual. If you read her stuff, she's sort of analyzing text, she's teaching herself French, she's talking about the Prussian War, right? And that kind of takes a back seat once she marries Frank. And they have a child who unfortunately dies, and Lottie often talked about that as being a moment in her life where she felt like she had didn't have as much of a purpose as she had before she got married.
And then Archie's wife.
Archie married a white woman named Sarah Stanley. They got married in the late 1870s. At the time, Archie was considered kind of a darling of Boston politics. Graduate of Harvard Law School. He gets his own law firm. He works with black attorneys. He marries Sarah Stanley. She has their daughter, Angelina Grimke, who they named after his aunt. And very quickly, something happens. It's really unclear what precisely was wrong with Sarah Stanley, or if anything was wrong with her, or if she was just, a woman who was stifled because she was very, very smart. Sarah Stanley moves with her family to Michigan. She takes 2-year-old Angelina with her and tells Archie she'll be back. And she doesn't come back for 5 years. And the ensuing 5 years, she writes all these letters in which she basically says that something has happened, that he's unfaithful. There's questions, was Archie cheating on her? I didn't find any evidence of that. That was the suspicion, but I didn't find it. Who knows? I couldn't find any evidence. She raises Nana in a predominantly, mostly white community in Michigan. And then suddenly, when Nana is 7 years old, says she can't handle being a mother anymore, says that Nana is having questions about her race, but that Sarah Stanley has never mentioned race to her. And basically, when she asks what she is, just kind of is like, someday you'll want to be around your own people again. And then literally puts her on a train in Detroit with a string around her neck and a bag, and basically says, you're going to see your father. She arrives in Hyde Park, Massachusetts. Archie then raises her for the rest of her life. And Angelina Grimke never sees her mother again. They corresponded over the years. Her mother eventually died of what appears to be an apparent suicide in California when Nana was in her teens.
And there's more. But what I wanted to also bring out, because I want people to really read the book. There's so much in there, and there are different other family members and things like that. And the themes, though, the trauma and dealing with some pretty serious issues, for instance, with the black women and their relationships, and the myth of promiscuity of black women to kind of explain some of these things. I mean, you go deep into this.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much so that by the time Angelina Grimke was born in 1880, when I was writing the book and reading the sources, I would often tell some of my friends and my sisters, this kid can't do anything right. Everything Angelina Grimke does from the time she's like 7 years old and gets off the train, throughout her life, there's always someone in her family accusing her of being immoral, accusing her of betraying her family name. And this could be for anything from when she's 7 years old, she arrives in Hyde Park and she gets into fights with people. And oh my goodness, that's her black side coming out, quote unquote, say her relatives. Or B, that's the enslaved side that's somehow revealing itself. Or she's just sort of bad, right? And so part of that had to do with the way that black women and black girls were policed and still are policed, in terms of, black little girls being told, that there's certain things you can't do or should not do, not just because you're a child, but because somehow that bears poorly on other black women and other black girls, right? And so this was very apparent to me in the text. It was also apparent that Angelina, who they called Nana, asked a lot of questions about her family. Because she's a biracial child of a family. She's living with her white relatives in Hyde Park for part of the time. She's asking them questions. When she asks about the Grimkes, they say, oh, well, they were wonderful, they were saints. And then she moves in. When she's 14, she moves to D.C., in with Frank and Lottie. She ends up going to the Dunbar High School for a little while right here in D.C., and she asks them, and in the house is Nancy Weston, who's now an older lady. She's in the house with them, and she wonders, well, why can't her grandmother read, right? And why does her grandmother, whenever she asks about Charleston, she's like, oh, it's sad. And why is her name Weston, right? not Grimke, right? Why is she saying that she's a Weston, right? If she's also saying the Grimkes are, the salt of the earth, right? Well, why then isn't she saying she's a Grimke, right? And so to get to your point about black women and being policed, I think that, the ways in which black women's bodies were not their own under enslavement, and then slavery ends, and still it's as if their bodies are being policed, whether it's by black men or by the church or by their parents or whoever. It's like nothing they can do is right in the eyes of this specific moment, which is that 40-year period after the end of the Civil War, right? So much so that like Frank Grimke has all of these tirades in his private papers where he believes that the reason why black people in DC lose control over their schools is because black women are hanging bare-armed from windows, right? He basically says that, if black women could sort of pull themselves together and not sort of show themselves, the white community in DC would respect the black community, and therefore they wouldn't take away this control that the black community, minimal control that the black community had over public schools. So I saw this in everything that they wrote about, and that wasn't a statement by Frank Grimke. We were all laughing, but people kind of took that seriously. Oh my goodness. There were all these groups about how teaching black women how to put your, I would be in trouble, but you had to put your arms, these are the clothes you should wear, these ridiculous things, but it was taken seriously. And that then colors the way a whole generation of young people, particularly black girls, are brought up and how they're taught to look at themselves.
We're going to have time for question and answer, from what I understand, but I have to.
I talked too much.
No. What if this last? Before we open it up, I mentioned that you get into a lot of deep things. So you're deeply researched, but also bringing up generational trauma, all of these things. You also talk about the black community and the class part. Mm-hmm. Right? There's a whole chapter on that.
Yes.
Which was really fascinating.
Yeah, one of the things, when we talk about the legacies of slavery, we have to talk about the ways in which the legacies of slavery impact how black people talk about ourselves and talk within communities, and assumptions we make about communities, right, that are kind of internal. And so one of the things I noticed is that Archie and Frank were very, very judgmental in private about other black people. At one point, Angelina was a queer woman, so she had relationships with women, she had one with men. And of course, Archie and Frank are beside themselves. They send her away to school when they find out she's with a woman. They send her to Minnesota. She comes back, she gets kicked out of that school. She goes to another school, she gets kicked out of that one. And finally, she goes to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she meets a man who's a black man who's a musician. And so it's a man, because they've been telling her to stay away from women, right? They go to this party, and she basically says, this is the man she wants to marry. She goes to her father, and her father's first response was, well, he's too dark-skinned. And if you marry him, I can't have anything to do with you. And so there's those things, right? The way that they talk about themselves, the way they talk about their communities. I often found similar phrases, which was very eerie, that the Grimkey sisters used, in the 1830s, that them then recycling in some way, in the 1890s.
You really exposed a lot. And I remember reading some of it and saying, oh, she said that.
Yeah.
Oh, my. So let's open it up, because this is, you went there, as they say.
Yes.
Okay, we have some mic runners here. Anyone feeling like they want
raise
to
your
ask a
hand.
question?
Right.
Raise your hand, please. Right.
And remember that if you raise your hand, and that means you are giving permission for this to be seen.
You're part of posterity.
Just.
So you're gonna have to forgive me on most of the names and help me out here. But you mentioned, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, at the time of the passing of the brother/father, that she, in addition to the two sons that you continue to talk about, she was pregnant with a third child. Mm-hmm. Did that child not survive into adulthood, or what happened to that third child?
Is that John?
That's John. Very good question. So John, there's a third Grimkey brother who was born in 1852. He was, 13 years old when the Civil War ended. He was the one who stayed the most with Nancy. We know that he ended up going to Lincoln as well. And one of the things that was the hardest for me to detect was why the white Grimke sisters reacted to John differently than they reacted to Archie and Frank. So by the end of John's second year at Lincoln, the tale that's going around the white Grimke household is that John is not as bright, that he's a failure, that he's immoral, and so they basically take away all support from him, right? And as a result, again, formerly enslaved 16, 17, 18-year-old, mother is now living with his brother. He basically then makes his way through odd jobs throughout New York. There's evidence that he ends up in Maryland, where he taught at a school for a little while, but then, of course, he can't get the certificate to be approved as a teacher because the Grimkes take away the money, so then he has to travel around and work. At one point, he appears in around the 1890s, portraying himself as a member of an upper-class family, and the newspapers actually make fun of him. They're like, this is the wayward brother of the Grimkey brothers. He's pretending he's someone he's not. He's found drunk in public, and then he eventually dies in the early 1900s. And so I didn't understand, although I'm saying that, but I kind of had my suspicions of why it is that he's kind of seen as a failure when the two other brothers aren't. And one of my colleagues pointed out, they were like, well, he looks has much more African American features than the other two. He also was the one who was the littlest during the height of Montague's abuse. Did he have something to say about that to the Grimkes when they actually came? So he is another person. If another book to come out of this book would be someone to do a deep dive on finding him and exactly what happens to him. But the brothers basically talk to him when Nancy dies in 1895. They send him a letter and say, "Can you help pay for funeral expenses?" And he says, "I have no money. I loved our mother, but there's nothing I can do." And they basically call him a failure and don't contact him again.
I think we went over here.
There's a school at Vermont Avenue and U Street, and it has the Grimke name on it. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, that's the Archibald Grimke School.
It's Archie.
Yep, and so he, when he died in the late 1920s, the city, D.C., named a school after him. He and Frank were very involved in the 1880s in forcing D.C. to open more black public schools than the one that existed in 1870. And so we're very much, participants in expanding public education in the city.
Right here.
Hi. In the book, there's a cast of characters.
Yes.
But I've been looking for a family tree, a
Yes.
chart, or a timeline. Am I overlooking it?
No, there is not one in there. My publisher, and hopefully they'll see this and they'll do it. The next edition, which is when they add stuff in, they're supposed to redo the cast of characters and redo
would be nice.
Something that will show sort of the timeline of the family.
And some of those photos,
But
too.
anyway, yes.
Because it would be in those photos.
Yes.
Because you have to flip to see the
Yes, yes, yes.
sisters and then see the brothers over there.
Hello, this is very exciting for us. We're members of 15th Street
Oh, wonderful.
Presbyterian Church, and so we thought we have to come and hear this.
Yes.
And
Frank's church.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about Francis, although Frank, I'm thinking, Francis, are we talking about the same
Yes.
person? And I'd love to hear a little bit more about his story. It's all very fascinating to hear your take on this, so thank you.
Yes. Well, I will say Frank was, his contemporaries like Carter G. Woodson and Anna Julia Cooper called him a Puritan at heart. So their take was that he was very conservative just by nature. And he, in the book, I point out that when he came to D.C. after graduating from Princeton Theological Seminary, he was not known in the black community here. And in fact, his cousins, the McKinleys, who were related to the Westons, were much more respected and known. And so at the time, he's coming from Princeton. He gets the post as head of this church, and there was skepticism in the black press about him, right? Who is this young person? Where is he coming from? He was formerly enslaved. What are they doing to this church that they have this man who's formerly enslaved becoming head of the church? Again, this is the 1870s, right? And that church has its history in the free black community here in DC. So that community's response is, why are we getting a minister who we don't know who he is, and he's formerly enslaved, and that's all we know. So when he married Lottie, that gave him a cachet in the community because her Fortin and Purvis cousins were here. One of them becomes a doctor who attends to President Garfield when he's attacked. And so that's a Fortin cousin. So just by marrying Lottie, that kind of increases his cachet in the community. And then, of course, from there, they realize he's brilliant, and he's an organizer, and he runs women's circles, and there's evidence. One of my colleagues, Cabria Baumgartner up at Northeastern University, has done work on finding that he ran like this informal foster care system for children in the community who didn't have families. And so he's doing all this wonderful work. My take is I was more interested in what is behind kind of all the success of black people who emerge as supremely successful, extraordinarily successful, 1870s, 1880s, and yet they're coming from families in which there's these types of very open secrets, right? And so yes, he's successful. Yes, he's doing good things. At the same time, he's getting mad at his niece because she's writing poetry instead of becoming a teacher, right? He's, refusing to admit certain people of certain skin tones into the church because he says it is going to sully the church. So those two things can exist at the same time, right? And I was sort of really interested in how they exist at the same time.
Hey, we have a question over here. Right over here, Clay. Oh,
And then,
right over here.
and before we end, too, I want you to tell us what's next, because I can't wait to tell me what you're working on.
Do you speak at all about the conflicts that exist between suffragism and abolitionism?
Oh, so that's a good question. So the abolitionist movement, and particularly the brand of abolition or anti-slavery that the Grimkey sisters subscribed to, really argued that slavery was a sin. And so I make a point in the book. I'm not saying that they were somehow insincere, or they were somehow lying, or they somehow believed that slavery was good. They didn't, right? They honestly, and to their soul and moral being and their religious belief, was that slavery was a sin. However, like many people who subscribe to anti-slavery, white people who subscribe to anti-slavery, it didn't mean that they believed that black people were equal in any aspect of figuring out how slavery would end. And so they have a real problem, for instance, when they got to Philadelphia, and the black community has been doing this work, they arrived in the 1820s, had been doing abolitionist work since the 1770s at least. And so they have all these networks that the black community has that the Grimkey sisters kind of bulldoze in and say, well, we're gonna start this thing. And they're rubbing up against the black community that has been doing it and doing it pretty, radically on their own. And so the white Grimkey sisters, and it wasn't just them, I mean, they're like the prototype for this, of having a hard time interacting with black people once black people are giving opinions and saying, well, your method of doing this hasn't worked. We know it hasn't worked. Your suggestion, for instance, that we punish black children who are late to school, we say that's not gonna work because black children have to work in order to go to school. So punishing them for not coming, no, so they have these conversations and debates. Suffragists who emerge during and after the Civil War argued that women should have the right to vote alongside formerly enslaved people with passage of the 15th Amendment. And there was a break in the suffragist movement because some white women who had been anti-slavery activists argued that yes, all women deserve the right to vote, but it was the colored man's hour. The 15th Amendment was going to enfranchise black men who were at the mercy of marauding people and crowds and undemocratic processes in the South. They should support the 15th Amendment. There was another group, Elizabeth Cady Stanton among them, who argued that to give the suffrage to men was to give the suffrage to, in her words, sort of the lowest castes of society, right? And so she's talking here about Chinese people, black people, and immigrants, right? And basically saying that. So there's a split. And so I think in the book that part of that split has a lot to do with the fact that many white anti-slavery women had not really reckoned with how they actually looked at black people, right? It's very fine to say, slavery's wrong, this is horrible, I'm going to rescue you. It's a different thing when you say that person who you're so-called rescuing is like, well, actually, this is what we need, right? And them constantly coming up against that.
One question here.
Hi, so I had actually wanted to return a little bit to Frank, because what I was really wondering was why he's so strongly focused on black women and their relationship with the black community as a whole. And one thing that I was really curious about was, do you think that may have stemmed from his mother's own struggles against Henry Grimke? And do you think that resentment may have led him to really strongly kind of put this emphasis on black women's behavior?
I think you've said it well. I mean, I would think so. Again, writing the book, he's not going to have like a letter where he's saying, and I act this way because my mother. Like nobody's that self-reflective. But I do know that when I was looking at the way he's talking about, and I say this in the book, the way he's talking about black women in his congregation mimics the way that many of the accounts of black women in the slaveholding press in Charleston when he was a child. Now, that's not to say that I'm not arguing that he somehow read these and then absorbed it, but I'm saying that there's a connection there, right? And there's a way in which absorbing and coming from that environment where you know that your mother has been assaulted, victimized in this system, and there's nothing you can do about it, right? But what can you do now that you're an adult? Well, you can kind of strictly police black women in the community so that theoretically, nothing bad is going to happen, right? And he was, to his credit, the community in his church adored him, right? But this is just to sort of complicate the story of what is actually going on behind the scenes of that adoration.
Time for one more question here. Right over here, Taylor.
And then we're going to end with my question.
Yes.
What's next?
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Your research is so impressive, and I'm just wondering if you could share, pull back the curtain a little bit. Was there one, or I'm sure there were many, sort of goosebump moments in the archives, right? What was a favorite memory from actually doing the research where you, found something that opened up a new perspective? Or just wonder if you could share a story from your archival research.
I think probably one of the goosebump moments was the Moreland Spingarn at Howard University. I owe a lot to them and Library of Congress for helping me do the research. Was that Angelina Grimke was sitting at Archie's bed when he was dying, and he says, I'm going to tell you about my life. And she's been asking him about his life since she was 7 years old. So she gets out paper and she starts writing it, and you can actually see in the document that she's writing really, really quickly. And then she goes back and says, come back to this, because he's just pouring, indicating that he's probably talking and then he literally dies while he's telling her these things. It's horrible. And on one of the pages, it's page 7 of that document, he just keeps saying Montague was a brute. And he tells her to underline it. So she underlines it so much so that it goes through the paper and it bleeds through. And then he says, tell them Montague was a brute. It's on the next page. And so that to me was goosebumps, because you've had this man who all his life he's been saying the Grimkes were the salt of the earth, they're the greatest people, we grew up, we didn't know any problems underneath slavery. And then you get to this thing on his deathbed and he mentions his half-brother for the first time and basically says, tell them that he was a brute, and then he dies. So I think that to me was sort of it gave me goosebumps, and also said there was probably more to this story than people were thinking.
And that's what that primary research, I have to just say, when you see the real thing and you see that, it comes through. So what's next? Give us the inside scoop. Who are you writing about? What are you researching? What?
The next book is a Black history of New England from 1630 to the 1950s, and I interweave multiple biographies in there. So it's a daunting task. My agent is on my case because I have to get something to her, but
And just a couple of names, if you throw out.
Quack Walker, who sued for his freedom in the 1780s. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who founded the National Association of Colored Women. William Worthy, who famously traveled to China during the Cold War, and his passport was taken away from him. He's from Boston. Eugene Gordon, who became a leader of workers' rights in Boston during the early 20th century.
And you're being quoted, I have to show. If you didn't see it, February 18th. A story about the richest black woman in New York, but Brent Staples, and he called you.
Yes, he did call me and said he was going to do this story. And, so,
mentioned your book, this book, and your research and everything. So we just thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank
This is
you
wonderful.
for sharing this.
Kerri will sign books in the back. Please buy books and have Kerri sign them and come back to the next Live at the Library. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you so much.